see. We're talking about examining our God talk today. And that's because every few years I like to talk about the way we talk about God. Our God talk. The words that we use can reveal a great deal about our embedded theology. Unless you were raised in an atheist household, everyone has some form of embedded theology. Because for the most part, we believe in the same God that our parents did. In fact, biologist and best-selling author Richard Dawkins once offered this trenchant observation. He said, "Isn't it a remarkable coincidence? Almost everyone has the same religion as their parents. And it always just happens to be the right religion." Remarkable, isn't it? And even if we might have changed our beliefs at some point, we all know that kind of indoctrination can have lingering effects, and it can seep into our current worldview in ways that we might not even be aware of. Now, most of you know that I was raised Catholic. I even entertained the notion at one time of becoming a priest, even going so far as to complete 5.5 years in the seminary, high school, and college, until I decided that there were other things that interested me, that priest, yes, indeed. So,
and other ladies.
Yeah, lots of reasons, but she'll take credit for that. So I've got this embedded theology, or at least I had for a long time, this embedded theology that said God's going to condemn you to hell if you intentionally missed Mass on a Sunday, or didn't go to confession, and so on and so forth. Now, when I was about 6, I was shocked, I tell you, shocked to learn that my Protestant friends apparently had a different God. This God didn't care a lick about Mass or confession. I mean, their God seemed to be a lot more lenient. Although I did have some Protestant friends for whom it was dancing and drinking that would get you sent to hell. And you would think that with all of the adults around me, you know, my parents, the priests, the nuns, someone would have been able to explain why there were these 3 different gods. Because they all had different rules about what got you sent to hell and so on and so forth, but nobody ever talked about it. I mean, it couldn't possibly be the same God. Not with all those different rules. And it was like this huge elephant in the room that nobody wanted to acknowledge. You know, just, oh, well, they do their thing, we do our thing. Yeah, thanks a lot. That's why it's so important to examine and re-examine our God talk from time to time. Every few years, it's interesting, useful, and I think kind of fun to do that. As you might imagine, people often ask me if we believe in God in unity, which I find to be a very interesting question, because you just know that they're coming to that conversation with their own image and idea of God. They've got their own God talk. They have their own embedded theology, and they're assuming that everyone else is sharing that same idea or concept. So, when they ask me whether I believe in God or whether we believe in God, I say, which one? Time for a surprise test. Now relax, this is not for a grade. I got this, by the way. I have to give credit to Tom Shepard, who used to be the senior minister at Sunrise Unity in Sacramento for many years, until he moved on to Unity Institute, where he would teach theology and religious history for quite some time until he retired here just a couple of years ago. Now this presentation comes from a talk that he did at one of our conferences, and again, no grade on this one, strictly for your own enlightenment. So, here comes the question. Do it in your head, don't have to say it out loud. Are you an atheist? And notice, multiple choice, 2 answers, yes or no, You have 20 seconds. Go. Ten seconds. There it is. There it is. Now that wasn't so hard, was it? So now, for the grading, okay? First of all, for all of you who tried to weasel out with a yes and no answer, you get an F. Although you're probably a born theologian or a lawyer, I would say. If you try to get away with a yes and no answer, you get an F. All right. Those of you who said yes, thinking that it was some kind of a trick question, you have committed an abomination. You have committed an abomination because, according to the God of the Bible, the God of Israel. There it is. Yahweh, the God of Israel, is not happy with you this morning. And if you've ever read the Bible, then you know that Yahweh don't play. Now, for those of you who answered the question no and denied their atheism, I would like to invite you to address your next prayers to Thor, or Jupiter, or Zeus, or Zoroaster, or Apollo, Mars, Poseidon, because there have been literally thousands of gods throughout human history, which means that everyone has at least 100 gods or so that they don't believe in. Or as they say, according to someone's religion, everyone is an atheist. And according to someone's religion, everyone is going to hell. That's what happens. That's what happens with our embedded theology. And getting back to the original conversation with that person who asked if we believe in God, well, at this point they just kind of roll their eyes. They say, oh, come on, of course, nobody believes in any of those false gods. I mean the God of the Bible. As if that helps to clarify the issue. And my response is basically the same. Which God of the Bible? And at this point their eyes get really wide. And they get this look of shock on their face. But I'm serious. Which God? Is it the God who created everything and called it good? Or is it the God who later decided that creation was bad and tried to destroy it? Is it the same God who said that men must be circumcised, women are unclean, and nobody eats pork? Or is it the other God who came along later and said, never mind, pork is fine, especially bacon. Don't worry about the kosher stuff. Just turn the other cheek. They can't be the same. And yet people will twist themselves into rhetorical pretzels trying to argue that it's only one God and one set of rules in the Bible. And actually what we're seeing in the Bible is just like the stories about Zeus and Apollo and the other gods of history, we're seeing fallible human beings who are telling stories trying to answer the big questions in life. Where did we come from? Where are we going? And how should we live? Is it any wonder that there are differences in different cultures around the world? What we're seeing in the Bible is what we see throughout human history. It's our human tendency to project ourselves out onto the universe and insist that there has to be this supreme human-like being who runs the show and who seems to make the same mistakes that we do, has regrets, changes his mind, although some might say her mind, becomes jealous and angry and all of that kind of stuff. And of course, the way it works out is wherever it is you happen to be born, God looks like your people, has all the same preferences for language, food, hygiene as your people do. Here's a word that describes what I'm talking about. Anthropocentric. Regarding humans as the central element of the universe, or interpreting reality exclusively in terms of human values and experience. Now, human beings are certainly an integral part of the universe. But we're learning that the universe can do quite well without us. If the earth and everything on it were to disappear tomorrow, the universe would roll along as it always has, and chances are very good that there are other conscious life forms somewhere out there in the universe, in a universe that's this large, a universe that's made of billions of galaxies. It's likely that we're not the only game in town. We've learned a lot since that anthropocentric worldview was so common. And unity has always taken a very different approach, a very non-anthropocentric approach to God talk. Back in the late 1800s, the Fillmores, they hired an author by the name of Emily Cady to write a series of articles which later became this book called Lessons in Truth, which is a very well-known book in Unity circles. If you're just being introduced to it, it's worth taking a look at. A very popular book in Unity circles where she talks about this totally different way of trying to answer the big questions and a totally different way of framing our God talk. Here's what she wrote. She starts out by noting that broader and more learned minds are always cramped by the thought of God as a person, for personality limits to time and place. And then she says that God is the name that we give to that unchangeable, inexorable principle at the source of all existence. And finally, this one. God as the underlying substance of all things, God as principle, is unchanging and does remain forever uncognizant of and unmoved by the changing things of time and sense. Many have thought of God as a personal being. The statement that God is principle chills them, and in terror they cry out. Sounds a bit overly dramatic. In terror they cry out. But I can tell you that in my experience, this idea of God as principle meets with resistance, even by people who have been in unity for a long, long time. In fact, a lot of people are in unity for a long, long time, and they never run into the works of Emily Cady for some reason. And when they go back and they read this, which goes back to the very foundations of unity, they meet with resistance. I mean, Emily Cady knew it was true then, and it's still true today. I would suggest that what she's talking about here, God as principle, has some serious and far-reaching ramifications for how we relate to the universe, and especially how we relate to each other. I would say that when it comes to the universe expressing as each one of us, when it comes to the way that human beings come into existence through this process that started with the Big Bang and the very building blocks of life being forged in the stars and so on and so forth, when it comes to the way that the universe shows up as us, there is nothing more personal than that. And that all happens based on a set of natural laws, these rules that we, by right of consciousness, get to discover and understand. Now, that's not the same as saying that we know everything, that we know everything about those laws, or that we will ever know everything. But the great thing about this approach is that it holds true for all people everywhere. It doesn't carve out exceptions for certain groups based on local customs and preferences and things like that. In other words, it unites rather than divides, which I think is a major improvement. One source, one essence, one set of rules for everyone. Or, as we like to say, one presence and one power expressing as the universe, as life itself. Think about what might happen if we could view these ever-changing events of life through that lens of one presence and one power principle. If we were to consciously and intentionally use that as our starting point, would it still be possible to marginalize and oppress another human being based on such superficial things as skin color or because of the ethnic group they belong to or the culture where they originated? One presence, one power acknowledges the ultimate unity of all things. I keep coming back to that word. The unity of all things and all people, even in the face of this diverse and constantly changing set of forms that we see around us. And again, it doesn't really get more personal than that. And it recognizes the fact that we don't know everything yet. It's a big universe. And a question that we might want to ask when we think about our own God talk today, the question we might want to ask is this: can our God talk, our worldview, expand along with our knowledge? Or do they hold us back? Are they limiting or are they liberating? Are they divisive, carving off some people and saying they're going to hell, but my group isn't? Are they divisive or do they unify? These are questions that we get to ask. It's a great freedom that we have, a great privilege that we get to ask these questions and answer for ourselves. Don't have to accept what Mommy and Daddy taught us. We get to investigate and answer for ourselves. And this reminds me of something that Carl Sagan said in one of his books. I like to bring this out every so often. He says, how is it that hardly any major religion has looked at science and concluded, this is better than we thought? The universe is much bigger than our prophets said, grander, more subtle, more elegant. God must be even greater than we dreamed. Instead, they say, no, 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 my God is a little God, and I want him to stay that way. And that's from a man who was a self-described agnostic. My God is a shrinking God, and I want him to keep on shrinking. Why is it so hard for some folks to look at the universe and say, isn't that brilliant? It expands, it grows, and everything builds on what came before it. Creation is going somewhere. Who knows what might be in store for humankind as we continue to grow and evolve according to principle, which works the same way for everyone. Principle, expanding possibility, those are the ideas that I keep coming back to when I hear a fundamentalist talk about God as the gray-haired man in the sky who controls the weather, has a favorite baseball team, right? And whenever I hear an uninformed atheist declaring that all God talk is nonsense. Because most atheists who say that, they're reacting to the sky God concept. The supernatural being, the gray-haired guy in the sky who sits in the heavenly control room. Now, if that's the sum total of your God talk, or the God talk that you've ever heard of, then yes, of course, that's nonsense, and you're going to think it's nonsense. But there are so many people in the world today who embrace reason and still think that all forms of religion and spirituality, including their God talk, are based on this kind of outdated idea and that kind of God talk. They don't know that there's an alternative. Maybe they haven't read Carl Sagan yet, although I find that kind of hard to believe. Sometimes it feels like I'm standing out in the middle of a desert somewhere, shouting, hey, over here. We got something different that you think that you might find interesting. And if they show up and they don't find it interesting, well, that's okay. They can stay for a cup of coffee, a sandwich, and we'll see what we can agree upon. Because that's where it starts, with that conversation with ourselves, and then we expand that outwards, and hopefully we end up somehow on the same page. But it'll never happen unless we first re-examine our own ideas, our God talk, and our embedded theology. So that's it for today. See you next week. Thank you.